Welcome to another episode of the WAN Manager Podcast. I am your host, as always, Bryan, and this is the show where we talk to networking experts about the data services that make business possible. So a lot of folks who listen to the show will remember that once each year we here at TeleGeography do a survey of WAN managers. Many of you listen to the show. Thanks for that. If you're listening to the show and you are a WAN or IT infrastructure manager, I would be remiss not to tell you that we'll talk later in the episode about when exactly, but we're doing, of course, the survey again in the coming year, and you really, really should participate. And you're going to hear all the interesting insights that we got out of this survey through the course of updating it in 2021. So today, my guest, it's not going to be solo. I have my colleague, Elizabeth Thorne, who was really the driving force behind the survey this past year, doing a lot of the interviews, collecting a lot of responses, and actually writing up the report. So this is the first year where I didn't have as direct hand in it, but of course, I have really enjoyed reading the results that she came up with, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Greg. I'm always so happy to be on the podcast. It actually hasn't been too long since we last talked for our year in review, but as you said, this podcast is going to be all about the results of our WAN manager survey, and this was kind of my baby this year, so I am really excited to dig into some of the results that we got.
Yeah, and no holiday party going on in the next room while we're recording this episode, so a little bit easier to focus maybe. Although I think we had some great end of the year insights, which some of the survey stuff made it in, but weren't quite done with it yet. So you're going to have a lot of, and we'll go more in depth on a lot of things. Why don't you, if you could maybe just start out just giving us some background on the survey itself. Who did we talk to? Where are they from? That kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was our fourth year conducting the survey, which means that at this point, we have quite a bit of year-on-year data, especially for the network section. But as usual, this year we asked corporate WAN managers about their network topologies, geography, and decision-making. And as well, this year we focused on network security, specifically zero trust security and SASE, secure access service edge, and how WAN managers are approaching those sorts of next generation security ideas in their own organizations. Yeah, so the WAN manager survey targets mostly corporate network managers at multinational companies. We tend to target the kind of global 5,000, the largest private and publicly owned companies. Kind of briefly going into some of the demographic breakdown.
Yeah, definitely interesting to know who we're talking about, because that makes a big difference in their network decisions.
So yep. So like 86% of respondent companies had like $1 billion or more revenue in 2020, and the median revenue was like $6.6 billion, and the median employee count was 17,000. So these are pretty huge companies, by and large, that we're talking to. Additionally, there was a pretty widespread industries. The most common was financial services. However, we had enough responses from financial services, business services, technology, auto and trucks, and industrials that we were able to actually break out those results by industry in the full report.
Yeah, and I think one thing worth noting too is that almost everyone who participated would be a multinational, but most were also multi-regional too.
Yes.
So maybe a few that only have network in, say, maybe the Americas or something like that. But really, mostly we're talking about enterprises with a global reach, which is going to make a difference too.
Yes, absolutely. Like, although most of these companies were headquartered in the U.S. or U.S., Canada, or Western Europe, which is also pretty typical of most multinational companies, right? There was a pretty wide global spread in terms of sites. I think it was like maybe 40% of the average sites were not in Western Europe or US. So that gives you an idea of how kind of disparate that is.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're now, as you said, in the fourth year. So we have the ability to do some time series analysis to see how things have changed. It's been a tumultuous 4 years, perhaps, compared to what it could have been. Starting this in 2018, I don't think I would have anticipated just how much change there might be over that course. So it's kind of interesting to see.
Absolutely. I mean, of course, the kind of top of the line takeaway, the big result that we saw, especially looking at that time series analysis, is in terms of the decline of MPLS. Right. We saw for the first
headline.
That's the big headline. The death of MPLS. For the first time in our survey history, MPLS usage actually dropped below half of average sites. We saw 46% of sites were running MPLS in 2021. Meanwhile, DIA has been on a steady increase, and in 2021 was at 42%. So they're like neck and neck with each other.
Maybe they'll cross next year.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And in terms of sort of like a time series, MPLS declined by 5% CAGR over those 4 years, and DIA was a 3% increase. So that kind of gives you an idea of the way that those trend lines are going.
But I do find that really interesting that MPLS is ceding ground. It seems primarily to DIA. Broadband is still a little bit smaller. Wireless is still really small. So it's the primary trade-off we're seeing is really between MPLS and DIA. Not in, one of the ideas of SD-WAN is that you can accommodate any number of different underlay technologies, but thus far it's mostly been about swapping MPLS for DIA, it seems.
Absolutely. I think a lot of that comes down to, as we said, the kind of composition of the enterprises that we're talking to are huge multinationals, and therefore they oftentimes are looking for some of those performance and security assurances that you just can't get with broadband necessarily, even if they're trying to move away from MPLS.
And often a global supplier of these things, right? So maybe if you operate, say, network only in the US or even a region of the US, it's a lot easier to go with maybe an MSO or someone like that and get something like DOCSIS kind of service instead of DIA. But if you're buying a centralized global network and you're wanting to add internet, it's probably going to be mostly DIA still. So.
Yeah, definitely. We saw that bear out when it came to asking questions about sourcing. Obviously global providers are still the go-to for MPLS, but then with DIA, it's more of a mix of global and regional telcos or NSPs. In interviews, we heard a pretty common strategy for DIA sourcing was to go with a kind of a tier 1 global supplier, and then for secondary DIA, go with like a regional best in breed, depending on where you were.
I wonder, did you get much commentary on the sort of aggregator angle? Are they tending to go ISP direct or carrier as the sourcing agent, or did you talk to any folks who were going in that kind of like, well, I'll do this myself, but with somebody else's help for sourcing?
Yeah, I heard quite a bit of interesting color about broadband sourcing, So there was one person I talked to who they had actually gone the DIY route for their broadband sourcing, where they were managing all the contracts in-house, and they're actually having quite a bit of frustration with it, like exactly the type of frustration you hear that is one of those complications where they were, for example, like sourcing broadband in Germany. And when the one person in their office who speaks German was out, they couldn't deal with the provider. Absolutely. And also they didn't necessarily know about the IT environment, the telecom environment in that area. And so they found out they kind of got a bad deal. And this person I was talking to literally said, like, maybe if we'd gone with an aggregator, we wouldn't have had to deal with these issues. But then on the flip side of that, I talked to someone who, was thinking about or had looked at internet aggregators, but given that they were mainly looking at broadband as an area for cost savings, they found that when you added on the cost of management with an internet aggregator, it wasn't that much cheaper than just going with DIA. So that kind of lessened the appeal for them.
Yeah, and conversely, if you're using an aggregator for DIA, it might bring it up to MPLS costs. Now, there are reasons to use DIA beyond just the cost savings over MPLS too, like digital transformation and cloud and all that sort of thing. So certainly I could see pretty good arguments depending on your situation either way. Yeah. Excellent. Well, what about bandwidths? One of the things that we do in our hypothetical scenarios that I've created to kind of test our pricing and ground truth it and make it look like regular networks and look at what our benchmarking customers are thinking about when they come to us, is creating these hypothetical scenarios where we say, okay, you start out with an all MPLS network. One of the assumptions I always make is that even if you're not looking for savings, you're looking to increase your throughput. We've heard from people, I think, from a lot of different industries that, okay, when everybody returned to the office or started to return to the office, you're used to now doing Zoom. You might have even jettisoned some desk phones. And so you're going to need a lot more bandwidth for that UCaaS services. Did we see any of those increased bandwidth needs and just the cloud digital transformation? Do we see that play out in the reported bandwidths they're using?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, across MPLS, DIA, and broadband, we see a trend of port sizes 50 megs and over are on the increase in terms of procurement or in terms of their percentage of the overall port sizes in the corporate network, while port sizes like 50 meg and under, those smaller ones, have been on the declining from like 1 to 4%.
Right.
So we're definitely seeing that corporate networks are hungry for bandwidth.
Yeah, and that brings me to a thought about what this actually looks like. So we see the number of MPLS, number of sites running MPLS has gone down. MPLS was historically always pretty heavily weighted to the under 50 megs. So we're seeing this decline in port circuit connections that are under 50 megs. Some of that's probably coming from maybe jettisoning MPLS and adding in DIA of a much higher capacity than had been there, or broadband, of course. So it's like there's not just like a bandwidth migration, but some of it's the product substitution, I would think, in that as well. Right?
Oh, absolutely. So, yeah. I mean, broadband saw the biggest swings where it was like 100 to 500 meg broadband ports increased by like 5%. Right. That was like the biggest increase we saw across those 4 years. Versus MPLS, where because it's kind of universally on the decline, those changes were much smaller, like within 1% either way.
Right. Because they're not so much changing their MPLS port sizes themselves. It's that they're getting rid of maybe some of their bigger MPLS ports,
Right.
Altogether.
Or even it's more like they're getting rid of the small ones.
Right. Yeah.
Because those are the ones where like you could just throw in some DIA. And so therefore, as part of the relative mix, there's more MPLS ports, but more larger MPLS ports. But that doesn't necessarily mean they are procuring more MPLS. Do you know what I mean? It's just like the composition is changing.
And in broadband, there's just some plan availability changes. So in our business broadband report that came out last fall, we saw that the number of like fiber to the premises kind of plans had greatly increased over the past 3 years. So if your broadband circuits are going up in size, it might be that all of a sudden you actually have maybe fiber to the curb or fiber to the premises that wasn't available before, and so you can get out of the DSL that's rate limited and go to something bigger. So it's really also good to see that manifest in actual enterprise networks out there.
Yes, absolutely. And related to this conversation, especially about replacing MPLS with DIA, is the conversation of backups and redundancy. And we asked this specifically about MPLS because traditionally the most kind of redundant line you could have would be active MPLS. When we started the survey in 2018, that was the most common way that people had their MPLS configured. And we now see that using a alternative connectivity service like DA or broadband is now the most common way that WAN managers who have MPLS on their network are, adding that redundant line.
You really have to have SD-WAN to take advantage of that in the same way, right? So
absolutely. So that does show as well, kind of indirectly, the increased adoption of SD-WAN. But the interesting thing about that is that there are still people who have active MPLS. The greatest change has been the elimination of having a passive MPLS line and people who had no backup at all, who just had an MPLS line.
Flying by the seat of their pants.
Yeah, exactly. Those people have, now substituted DIA or broadband. So we're actually seeing some of that greater redundancy that was a promise of SD-WAN seeming to come to fruition.
No, that's really interesting because, again, back to my hypothetical networks, that's one of the things I look at, is just that even if you're not trying to realize massive savings, which has long been the kind of main argument about SD-WAN or whatever, and I think it's becoming less so because it's more about, accommodating digital transformation, about changing your security posture and all that sort of thing. That if you go from your MPLS fully redundant access lines, that's where it really gets you. Even if you have a passive MPLS backup port that's maybe charged at 50% or something like that, you still needed a redundant access line. When you can turn that access line into a broadband or a DIA circuit, then you get more capacity, have SD-WAN running, so you're doing load balancing, so you can use that as your backup, and that right there can like really increase the resiliency. In fact, one of the scenarios I did add sort of like at your tier one site, so to speak, a triplicate, right? So you had a dual MPLS connection. Now that becomes an MPLS DIA and broadband tertiary kind of connection, and that really changes the performance of your network. And it still ended up being cheaper, actually, in that case for most of them. But even if it's not, even if it's about the same price, I think that's what folks are after these days, is to accommodate all that cloud traffic without sending it through the centralized breakouts and all that sort of thing.
Right. And then kind of related to, talking about these hypothetical networks, is that there also might be, different configurations within the same network, depending on what the site's bandwidth requirements and performance requirements are. You might have some sites, your core sites, where it still has an active MPLS line, and then others where you've subbed out, maybe you have MPLS and DIA, or maybe some others where you have just DIA and broadband. And so that's allowing more flexibility as well in terms of, balancing cost savings and performance with your total budget.
Hey folks, this is Charles.
And Lizzie.
From TeleGeography. We have a quick aside before we get back to the show. Are you hiring in the WAN space?
It seems like everyone's either looking for their new position or they're trying to desperately hire for their department right now.
That's right. And if so, you might want to post your job to WAN Forum. If you haven't checked it out yet, it's a place for those who manage wide area networks and maintain IT infrastructure.
I've always found that going to industry-specific job boards tends to have a better success rate and yield a better crop of candidates compared to more general job boards. And that's exactly what we're trying to achieve by adding this new job openings area to the WAN Forum.
You can see what it's all about at wanforum.com. If you'd like a position to be posted to this community, shoot us a message at info@wanforum.com.
Now back to the show.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So what about the future? What do we think we see coming down the line in terms of product substitution and whatnot?
Right. Well, so one thing that kind of stood out in some of the interviews that we did, because this is not necessarily something that we surveyed.
We did not have a survey question about network as a service.
No, yeah, but so network as a service was a pretty popular topic among the interviews with WAN managers that we did. And network as a service obviously is kind of the ability to flexibly procure transport, mainly to data centers, but could be data center to data center, or for various types of different connectivity. But we did hear from companies who are utilizing those network as a service technologies and companies kind of combined with SD-WAN to kind of create their own private backbones between core sites, and
with dynamic sort of the ability to do bandwidth on demand between those in some cases.
Right, exactly. Yeah. A lot of people is like, if they are getting rid of their MPLS, a lot of time one of the big concerns is like, what am I going to do about my backbone if it's not running across a carrier's MPLS line or MPLS network? And so some people that we talked to are sort of like, okay, we're going to have internet enabled SD-WAN enabled internet for the branch sites, and they're going to connect at a data center. They're going to be going to a data center where then we have our own procured private connectivity through network as a service, connecting core sites and data centers. So This is some kind of a new strategy that we're seeing start to unfold among some companies.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. Good to get sort of real life confirmation of what that looks like from the interview side. Obviously, we'll have to work that into the future survey. But I should say, you've worked on our internet middle mile project.
Mm-hmm.
I've had on Christian Koch to talk about network as a service stuff that's up and coming. Him coming from the sort of data center side of things presently. So when it's done, which should be in Q1 2022, sometime here, I'll have on the principal investigator of that, Eric Kreifeld, our colleague, to talk more about what we're seeing. Because from where I sit, a lot of the network as a service stuff has been pretty nascent. And if we're doing this interview last year sometime, so the very sort of bleeding edge of adopting that, but it'll be good to check in on how things have emerged over the last 6 months even. So.
Yeah, not to go on a complete tangent about middle mile because I could, but I will say, because I'm currently working on that research product right now, so like my head is completely full of it. But from what I see of it, it's sort of like, it's not like, from a transport standpoint, it's the same. It's the same underlay, basically.
Right.
So most of the innovation comes from the flexibility on the commercial side. Easier.
They still have to buy wavelengths between the data
Exactly. It's
centers
just like the speed that you can procure it, and whether you can turn it up, turn it down, or turn it off when you need to. And that just allows for a lot of greater flexibility. It allows the network team to be more responsive and be more, application aware and like all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm personally really excited to see, how the enterprise network community ends up using it.
Yeah. Well, there's another aspect of it too, I think, in that we're TeleGeography. The geography of your network as a service provider's footprint ends up mattering, especially when it's your data center provider or sort of connected to your cloud service provider and that kind of thing. That then you're not thinking through the kinds of things like, is my network provider in this facility? So is my WAN that I get from them going to the right place? Does it have to connect from down the street even, or from another metro away? It's like creating this, like, it's sort of abstracting that layer away from you, right? So like in what I always love to say, whenever there's a cloud on a diagram, it just means I don't want you to think about this in this moment right now, right? And so it's sort of making part of your WAN into that cloud part. So it's just something that you might not have to think about, that you might have had to think about if you were approaching it from a traditional kind of network scenario. So yeah, like you said, we'll get a lot more of that.
Yeah, I was going to say, we could literally talk for the rest of the podcast about that, but we should probably move on.
Yeah, for sure. And so let's transition then to security, which, so in 2019, we asked about security for the first time in the WAN Manager survey. Then it was really all about zero trust. SASE was not a word. Zero trust and SASE are, of course, indelibly linked now at this point. But yeah, so what happened here? One of the things that really struck me in 2019, because we had heard some of the elements of zero trust being bandied about for a few years at that point, was that when we asked, what is it now, 2.5 years ago, a lot of respondents were kind of like, what is zero trust security?
Right, more than a third of respondents didn't even know what we were talking about.
That is not the case anymore, right? So
no, definitely not. We saw a pretty meteoric increase in just 2 years. In 2019, only 8% of respondents said that they had implemented some sort of zero trust security feature in their network versus 35% in 2021.
Yeah, big jump.
Yep. And the other interesting thing about that was we introduced a new option this year of like, do you plan on doing it, but you're kind of waiting on your SD-WAN deployment before you start implementing those sorts of things? And that was like the second most popular answer in 2021. So that definitely shows that like SD-WAN and zero trust security are also very linked together.
Yeah, it's always good when our survey bears out things that I have said publicly before, but like certainly that the order of operations should be, sort of adopt SD-WAN with security in mind, rather than the other way around of, I want to try to approach security from a SASE standpoint and then think about SD-WAN. That's the wrong direction. Right? So,
exactly. And we found that among, those who had implemented some part of it, multi-factor authentication and then single sign-on were the top zero trust features implemented. I think MFA in particular, it's like almost 100% of people who said that they had done some sort of ZTS. Right. They like MFA
that is the cornerstone of what ZTS is, right? Yeah. Because if you can't identify users and devices, then you're not doing zero trust, right? So and when you have multi-factor, if you're allowing people in without a multi-factor, then you certainly wouldn't want single sign-on without MFA, for example, right? So yeah.
No, definitely not. Given that zero trust is all about trying to mitigate the danger of compromised passwords.
Right.
And stuff
that was my point. Is that like if you're going to have a situation where the purpose is to identify users and devices. If you're not doing that with MFA, then you're really opening yourself up, because stolen credentials are way more likely than, we're all cultured by the hacker movies where they have
like
5 screens out and, I'm cracking the code, when it's really so much more mundane. It's that someone sent you a message on Facebook, and said, "Hey, what's your phone number again?" And yeah.
No.
What's your dog's name?
What's your mom's maiden name?
Yeah. You see all these things on Facebook that are like asking you, like, what's the street you grew up on, or what was your first elementary school? Yeah, don't do that.
No. But I will say one interesting thing about that. Obviously, like you said, those are kind of the cornerstones. But at the same time, those are also kind of the easiest to implement through existing enterprise software, like Office 365 or Microsoft Active Directory or the Google Suite, SSO. So one thing that I think bore out through the survey and through interviews was like, when it comes to zero trust security, not all of these principles are equal in ease of implementation. And people tend to go for the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah,
first.
Of course.
Yeah.
And I think we talked about this a bit in our year-end review, but that it's almost like as a part of the rest of your digital transformation rather than an explicit change in your security posture.
Mm-hmm.
Like you mentioned, like Azure or Google or something like that, where you're doing that to access that specific cloud product, not necessarily as a wholesale change in the way that you organize security for your network. It's just that everything needs to move toward that cloud model anyway. So you have MFA for your sign-on, you have MFA or SSO, say, for specific cloud products, but you need to get to a place where you have MFA and SSO for all of the network things you're doing, and then get rid of the kind of centralized firewalls and that kind of thing, or admins, passwords and whatnot, which that's another factor. The admin passwords tend to be something like admin, right? So yeah, so it's they're moving toward this ZTNA SASE posture, kind of little bits at a time, rather than with SD-WAN maybe doing something that's a much more sort of like stark wholesale change or a rip and replace kind of situation.
Well, exactly. And the things that would be much more of a wholesale change, like network segmentation, which also probably would be more in the purview of the network team.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone I talked to who had attempted some sort of network segmentation along zero trust security lines, basically had to put it to the side for a while, because it just wasn't realistic to attempt in a brownfield environment, given the tools that they had, from what it sounds like. So
yeah, and so it's going to be interesting to see as vendors come up with more of a full SASE stack or suite of services that's unified in a single plane of glass, as they like to say. That then it'll be more like you go in this kind of like, oh, we're now moving to this, rather than it's kind of picking up little things here and there, even getting Duo or something like that for a general kind of MFA service or something like that. Now, of course, we are 2 years, almost, we're just like a month shy of 2 years of this world.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that we've seen some of the work from anywhere, remote work, whatever you want to call it, manifest in the work stuff as well. Have we seen it manifest in the security side?
Oh, absolutely. In terms of factors driving companies towards approaching and adopting zero trust solutions, the increase in remote work was the top rated factor. And obviously, no surprise there. It is a shift from, when we first did this in 2019, in the quote unquote before times. It was like remote work was like more middle of the pack, and
Right.
increased cloud adoption and internet use were the top factors, which are still top factors now. Like those elements have not changed, and if anything, it's like remote work accelerated both of those trends, towards where this sort of perimeterless security became more and more pertinent.
Yeah, this was all underway, but it just lit a fire.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you could basically say that for all of these network trends. None of this was new, but it was greatly accelerated by remote work.
Yeah, because ultimately, really, at bottom, what's driving all of these security changes is the digital transformation and cloud changes, in the move away from sort of hub and spoke data center architecture and stuff like that, which was all already happening. It's just that having remote work just added to the need for that, even, right? Because you're not getting onto the WAN from a WAN site.
Yep. Exactly.
And so it's like but those things were already happening because that's where the software is, right? So yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, what about vendors? So that, to my point earlier about what we're really interested, I think, in seeing happen over the next year is how carriers, MSPs, vendors sort of end up packaging all of this into a cohesive product. We asked everybody in 2021 here about who they were using for security, and also just kind of what their vendor strategy was. So are folks getting security from a single vendor yet? That's I think the place to start.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, so we actually asked people, specific vendors as well, just to see what's going on in the market. And one interesting insight there was, the kind of largest incumbents, which is Cisco, Palo Alto, Fortinet. They were leading the pack in hardware, but they were also leading in the software-based security vertical. I think part of this might just be that people or companies, if they are, for example, already using Palo Alto or Cisco hardware boxes, they might spring for the software, white box version as well, if they're like thinking about also using that.
Also, those are all three SD-WAN vendors
They
too,
are.
which is I think really key here, right? So if you're using Viptela, Umbrella is probably not only rhymes, but is probably a logical choice, right? So,
but then the other insight from asking for these vendors was that when we tallied it up, we did find that most WAN managers were using multiple network infrastructure security vendors on their network. And part of that, there's probably some people who have like deliberate redundancy going on in their network. I talked to one person where they're at like a sorry. I talked to one person where they're at a large financial institution, and their security team basically said, we need redundant firewalls everywhere. So that's what they do.
Right.
But at the same time,
that's not everybody.
No, definitely not. Some of it is definitely just tech debt, especially with how many M&As go on. You might merge with a company where they have a different firewall system that they're using, and it takes a while to sunset that product, et cetera, et cetera. But the general attitude as well, just towards security vendor sourcing and management, still is that most companies generally seem to handle those relationships independent of their network vendors or their carriers. And so that, I think, would be the biggest change, or one of the biggest changes with SASE, is handing off that management of the security relationship to your network provider, basically.
Exactly. I think that is the change, like I alluded to before, that we're looking to see over the next few years, even really, is to have a one-stop shop for a secure access service edge, if you will, right? So then that just really is not there yet. And it goes back to what we were saying before, that the elements of ZTNA that folks have adopted might be, little pieces here and there, but you still might have a centralized breakout where you still have a traditional firewall and all that kind of thing. So I think it's going to take quite some time for folks to, just to pick an example that I used before, say, okay, well, we're going to use Umbrella for everything security. I think we're probably a ways away from that being a widespread phenomenon.
Definitely. I mean, I kind of included at the end of the security section just a little summation of some of the interview opinions about SASE, and the general attitude just seemed to be like it's not really a mature enough offering yet for a lot of large enterprises to seriously consider. Though of course people are talking about it and thinking about it. There's a lot of issues of scaling for a large multinational company, and fears of vendor lock-in. And also just the challenges of trying to implement something like that in a brownfield environment where you still have a lot of on-premises resources, and you still have physical sites, but you're also dealing with your remote workers. It's just like not quite settled yet.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and an environment where you still have a lot of MPLS out there, which is just why we didn't used to talk about security very much at the WAN Summit, because it wasn't much of an issue in the central breakout MPLS kind of environment, right? So there's a lot of moving parts and things that everybody can see and understand, but are just going to take a long time to sort of come to fruition, so to speak. Anything else about SASE that we gleaned from the interviews or anything like that?
I think my biggest takeaway is just that SASE is still very new, and honestly, for both us as analysts and for many large enterprise clients, there's still a question of what is it? What is it? What is the hype? What is the actual business ad for it?
Right.
And I think that's something that the vendor community will continue to refine and develop. And maybe what is like a mature SASE offering, we haven't even seen what that is going to be yet. Because even when I talk to other vendors, a lot of the times what their security offering is really is just like, we have a partnership with a cloud-based firewall company and we'll manage that for our customers, so maybe what SASE will really be will evolve from there, but it's still we're just gonna have to see.
Sure. SD-WAN 1.0 was basically load balancing, forward error correction, and then 2.0, now there's folks saying numbers beyond 2.0, even beyond 3.0, and ultimately that may actually really come to mean SASE, perhaps. So just kind of.
I was actually I was reading, talking about SD-WAN 3.0. I was reading about the sort of cloud WAN transport offerings that some of the major cloud service providers are doing, and one of them has. I was reading they have like a partnership with various SD-WAN vendors where you can create an SD-WAN like virtual machine basically in the cloud virtual hub to connect it to the rest of your SD-WAN network, and then kind of seamlessly flow that traffic onto the cloud backbone. So I was like, okay, like that's kind of, I remember reading about that sort of thing with SD-WAN 2.0 as a theoretical thing.
Right.
But it seems like now it's actually starting to be implemented. So
yeah. In the end, you still have to get there.
Yeah.
Over an internet connection. So that probably shouldn't be IPsec. So it's going to be interesting to watch, not so much from the technical perspective, but how these things get stuck together in a commercial way and from whom, right? So yeah, because again, in the end, it's still all wavelengths between data centers or local access. Like from the telegeography perspective, layers 1, 2, 3, it's still ultimately all the same thing, right? There are wires over which bits go, right? So a lot of the distinctions on how that work are, not just further up the stack, but are kind of how you present the commercial model to the customer, right? So.
Yeah, 100%.
Excellent. All right. So it is February 2022. We usually run this survey in Q2. So we'll be doing the survey again this year, Q2. Look out for it again if you're listening to this and are on the end user side. First, if you are not yet a member of our WAN forum, which is for end users only. So unfortunately, if you're a vendor in the telecom space, you cannot join the WAN forum, but that's for a very good reason, which is that it's this space for end users to be able to understand all of what we're doing at TeleGeography and even talk to each other. There is an actual forum there about what's going on. And there you can read this report in its entirety. If you're on the vendor side, of course, we're happy to hook you up with our sales manager to get a look at the report as well. But if you're not already a member of the WAN forum and you're from the end user side, definitely reach out to us, and we'd love to make you a member where you can find all of this. And we will then be putting the Q2 version of the survey when it's out. Now, we've done kind of every other year SD-WAN and security. So this should be an SD-WAN year. But per this conversation, the lines are becoming a little bit blurred anyway, right? And we're also changing the way that we think about the survey. We're going to move some of the network elements into a kind of more of a panel-based survey. And so those of you listening to this that we might meet at conferences and whatnot will have probably a little bit different of a survey this year. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So basically, we're looking at maybe refining and streamlining the survey that we send out to, WAN managers, focusing more on the kind of decision-making aspects.
Yeah, exactly. We can get the data on
management. And
where are your sites and how many of them have MPLS. We can get that from more of a sort of IT panel. Our plans and save for the IT infrastructure manager types, those of you listening and whatnot, for the deeper questions on like what kind of vendors are you thinking about and why, and where are you in these journeys, and how do you need to get from here to there. So probably focus on SD-WAN, but
maybe SD-WAN and SASE.
Yeah, exactly. That just knowing who has and has not adopted SD-WAN probably isn't that useful anymore, since we have a pretty good time series on that. We will still do that because we still do need to know that, but get more into what vendors you're using, why, and what other services are getting wrapped into SD-WAN, and then I think probably a little bit of a focus on how network as a service is developing as well. We had looked at cloud connectivity. I think that's moving into being more about middle mile performance anyway. So I think we're probably going to look more towards middle mile. But that's what's really cool here is then if you are on either side of the market, right, vendor or end user, feel free to get in touch with either Elizabeth or myself. You can find us both on LinkedIn, and tell us what you think we should focus on, especially within those topics of kind of SD-WAN and SASE integration, network as a service, and middle mile performance. What is it that you want to know there? And like I said, that should be coming out as a survey in Q2, and then we'll have that report done like this year in the very beginning of 2023. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. This was super interesting, even for me after having read the report, to talk through it again. So yeah.
Super glad to be back, and this is a really great conversation, and I hope the listeners got something out of it too.
Yeah, and to be talking to each other in the office.
I know.
Let's all be
Amazing.
honest. That is kind of nice. All right. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks to everybody listening. We'll see you again very soon. Thanks for listening. The WAN Manager podcast comes from the team at TeleGeography. It's edited and produced by Jane Miller, and it's hosted by me, Greg Bryan. I also wrote the theme song that you're listening to right now. To learn more about our data, jump over to telegeography.com. Or if you want to get right into more WAN content like you hear on the show, you can visit TeleGeography's WAN forum at wanforum.com.
We've got all of our podcast episodes over there, WAN Manager survey data, and extra analysis pieces. That's all for now. So until next time, WAN enthusiasts,